This pattern can be found in my Etsy shop, linked in the description below. Using the face placement guide from the pattern, place the nose piece on top of the snout piece. Sew this in place either by hand or with a sewing machine. If you're using a sewing machine, go slow and take your time. Using the guides from the pattern and a marking tool, mark the placement for the face and the ears on the right side of one body piece. Place the 2 felt eyes and the felt snout on the markings. Pin these in place. Using a matching thread, edge stitch around each eye and the snout. You want to be on the edge of the felt but still catching it in the stitches. These pieces are really small, so take your time and don't be afraid to leave the needle in the fabric and pick up the presser foot to readjust to make sure that you are staying on top of the felt. Now we're going to do the ears, and you want to make sure you pay extra close attention to the nap on these pieces. Make sure that the nap on both of these pieces is going downward. You're going to lay one earpiece on top of another with right sides together. Pin it in place. Now sew around the curve of the ear using a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Then you're going to repeat with the remaining ear pieces. Turn the ear pieces right side out so that seams are on the inside of the ear. Using the markings from the pattern, place the ears upside down on the top of the bare head. This should be done on the piece that has the face attached already. Pin the ears in place. Using the longest stitch on your sewing machine, baste the ears in place so that they don't move when you sew the rest of it. If you're having a hard time feeding that through the machine, grab the tail end of your thread and gently apply some pressure to help pull it through. Once it starts moving again, let the thread go. Lay one body piece on top of the other with right sides together. The face will be sandwiched in the middle. Pin this in place. Sew all the way around the body with a 1/4 inch seam allowance, leaving a 1 to 2 inch gap on the outside of one leg. Make sure that you take these curves really slow. These curves can easily turn into points if you're not careful, so especially on these arms and legs, just make sure you take your time and ease it through the machine. Clip into the seam allowance at the points between the arms and legs, and then between the head and shoulders. Be very careful not to cut through the stitches, you're just cutting into the seam allowance here. This will help the plushie have more definition and take the proper shape. Do be careful though, because if you get too close to your stitches, your plushie can develop a hole. Now that it's sewn, turn the plushie right side out through the gap left from sewing. You can do this either with your fingers, you can just reach inside and grab it, or you can use a turning tool. After the plushie is turned right side out, you're going to reach into the gap and use a blunt tool. Some people use a chopstick, I'm using a turning tool, and you're just going to want to push out all the curves from the inside of the plushie. This helps it take its shape, and while you're doing this, you can check to see if you got all the seam allowance in your stitches. Make sure there's no holes. Now you're going to stuff the plushie with polyfill. You can either use your hands and your fingers to get it in there, or you can use your turning tool. So how much polyfill you use will kind of determine the shape that the plushie takes. Sometimes you're going to need to smash it down or massage it a little bit to help encourage that polyfill to take a different shape. When the plushie is stuffed to your liking, tuck the seam allowance from the gap inside the plushie. Take a needle and matching thread and hand sew the gap closed using a ladder stitch. If you're not familiar with a ladder stitch, you just start with one small stitch on one side of the fabric, then move directly across to the other side. You're just going to keep going back and forth from one side to the other, kind of like making rungs on a ladder. That's why it's called a ladder stitch. Tie a few knots in the end of the thread. After I have a couple of knots, I usually like to make an extra stitch and then tie just a couple more knots. You know, just extra security. And then you're gonna stick the needle through the seam, through to the other side of the plushie, and clip the thread off. This will ensure that the tail of the thread stays tucked inside the plushie for a more secure finish. If you're doing the optional bow, thread the needle with a matching thread through the center of the felt bow piece. You're going to pull it through and pull it tight until it scrunches all together. Wrap the thread around the bow 3 times to hold it in place. Then you're going to thread the needle through one end of the felt tab piece and pull it until it sits on top of the felt bow. Then you're going to wrap the tab around the center of the felt bow piece. If there's any excess tab, you're going to trim that off. Tack the tab to itself with a couple stitches on each side. Then either knot it off and get a new thread, or if you still have extra thread on here, you're just going to go ahead and stitch it straight onto the plushie. Pick your placement, it could be top or one of the sides. Find where you want it to sit and then just tack it on with a couple stitches and then knot it off and trim the excess thread. Then that's it, you're all done! Your plushie is ready to be played with, squished, and loved on. Thank you so much for following along on this pattern. If you enjoyed this pattern, please feel free to take a look at some of my others in my Etsy shop. The link is in the description. Thank you so much, and I will see you in the next one.